Everyone's heard of the Gurkhas, but almost no one really knows what they were. You've heard the name. Maybe you've seen a photo of that curved blade. Maybe someone told you once that they were tough fighters from Nepal. But what you're about to hear goes so far beyond that, it almost doesn't sound real. These were soldiers who crawled through mud in pitch darkness to slit the throats of dozens of enemy troops without making a single sound. Men who charged into machine gun nests with nothing but a knife and came out alive. Warriors who the German military, the same force that steamrolled through Europe in a matter of weeks, described in official reports as not human. That's not a metaphor. That's not propaganda. That is a direct quote, pulled from accounts of soldiers who faced Gurkhas in combat and came out the other side shaking. And here's the part nobody talks about. The Gurkhas weren't some ancient relic from a forgotten era of warfare. They fought in World War I. They fought in World War II. They fought in the Falklands. They've been fighting for centuries, and they're still active today. Right now, there are Gurkha battalions on standby, trained, armed, and fully operational. So if you've ever wanted to understand what real military ferocity looks like, not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized textbook summary, but the actual documented, eye-witnessed, blood and mud reality of some of the most feared soldiers in human history, stay with this. Because what's coming is not what you expect. And if you find yourself wanting more stories like this, subscribe now. There's a lot more where this is coming from. Let's go back to the very beginning. Nepal sits wedged between two giants. To the south, India. To the north, China. And for centuries, the people of this landlocked, mountainous nation had no choice but to build themselves around their geography. The Himalayas aren't a backdrop in Nepal. They're the entire world. And living in that world, at altitude, in cold, with limited resources and constant territorial disputes, shaped a people in ways that flatland civilizations simply cannot replicate. The Gorkhali people, from whom the Gurkhas take their name, came from the region of Gorkha in central Nepal. In the 18th century, a king named Prithvi Narayan Shah used these warriors to unify Nepal into a single kingdom. The method wasn't diplomatic. It was brutal, fast, and decisive. Battle after battle, hill after hill, the Gorkhali forces expanded outward. They weren't just good fighters. They were tactically sophisticated, psychologically formidable, and physically capable in ways that surprised every opponent they met. By the time the British East India Company started pushing into the Indian subcontinent, Nepal was not a country to be taken lightly. And when the two powers eventually clashed in what became known as the Anglo-Nepalese War between 1814 and 1816, both sides got a very sharp education. The British had better technology. They had artillery, organized supply chains, and numerical advantages in many engagements. But the Gorkhali warriors kept fighting in ways that the British commanders had simply never encountered. Ambushes from terrain that seemed impassable. Night raids that left garrisons in chaos. Hand-to-hand combat so vicious and so effective that British officers started writing home about it with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't quite anything else either. The war ended in a stalemate, which in itself says everything. The British Empire, at the height of its expansion, could not fully defeat Nepal. So they did the next best thing. They made a deal. The Treaty of Sugauli in 1816 ended the fighting, and almost immediately, the British began recruiting Gorkhali soldiers into their own forces. The logic was cold and practical. If you can't beat them, hire them. But what followed wasn't just a military arrangement. It was the beginning of one of the most unusual and enduring alliances in the history of warfare. The first Gurkha units were formed under British command in 1815, even before the treaty was formally signed. The British officers who worked with them were astonished. These soldiers required almost no adjustment period. They were already disciplined, already accustomed to moving through difficult terrain, already trained in the kind of self-sufficiency that conventional armies spend years trying to instill. They needed no convincing that harsh conditions were normal. For them, harsh conditions were home. And then there was the weapon, the kukri. If you've never seen one up close, it's not what you'd expect. It's not long. It's not ornate in the way that ceremonial swords tend to be. It's a short, heavy, inward curving blade, thick at the spine, razor-edged on the inside curve. It's designed for one purpose, with mechanical efficiency. When you swing a kukri, the curve directs force inward and downward. It doesn't slash the way a straight blade does. It buries. It goes through. And in close quarters, where rifles become useless and bayonets become too long and too slow, the kukri becomes something close to absolute. There's an old saying, often attributed to Gurkha tradition, that runs something like this: a kukri should never be drawn without drawing blood. Whether that's accurate as a formal rule or not, it captures something true about the relationship between Gurkha soldiers and their blades. The weapon wasn't decorative. It wasn't symbolic in the way that dress swords tend to be. It was a tool, constantly maintained, constantly ready, and deeply personal. Every Gurkha soldier carries his own kukri. They are not issued and replaced like standard equipment. They are owned. And that distinction matters more than it might seem at first. Now, let's talk about what actually happened when the Gurkhas went to war under the British flag. Because the first major test of this alliance didn't take long to arrive. Throughout the 19th century, Gurkha battalions served across India, in Afghanistan, in Burma, in China. They were deployed wherever the British Empire found itself in trouble, and the pattern repeated itself over and over. The Gurkhas arrived in terrain that other units found impossible. They performed in conditions that broke conventional forces, and they came back with casualty rates that seemed impossibly low given the ferocity of what they'd been through. But it was the 20th century that turned the Gurkhas into something legendary, something that even hardened military professionals struggled to explain in purely tactical terms. When the First World War began in 1914, Gurkha battalions were sent to the Western Front almost immediately. This was a dramatic shift in context. The rolling hills of Nepal and the dense forests of Burma were one thing. The mud of Flanders, the industrial slaughter of trench warfare, the machine guns and artillery barrages of the Western Front, that was something entirely different. And yet the Gurkhas adapted. They had been fighting in mountains, where visibility was low, where terrain controlled movement, where the ability to navigate without light was often the difference between life and death. The trenches of France were miserable, but they weren't psychologically different from what Gurkha warriors had trained in for generations. You move in darkness. You use the ground. You identify your enemy by sound before you can see them. You strike fast, and you don't hesitate. The night raids that became a signature of Gurkha warfare on the Western Front weren't invented for the occasion. They were simply transferred from one geography to another. British commanders started deliberately assigning Gurkha units to operations that required moving silently through no man's land, approaching enemy trenches in darkness, eliminating sentries without raising alarm, and gathering intelligence or prisoners before withdrawing before dawn. The German soldiers on the other side of those raids started talking. Field accounts from German trenches during the First World War describe a specific, almost visceral fear that developed around nighttime operations in sectors held by Gurkha units. The anxiety wasn't about artillery or bombardment. It was about the silence, about the fact that sentries would simply disappear, about waking up to find that someone had been in your trench during the night and you'd heard nothing. No gunfire, no struggle, nothing. Just an empty post where someone had been standing hours before. There's something psychologically distinct about an enemy you cannot hear coming. Rifle fire, artillery, even the sound of boots on gravel. These are things the human brain can process, can prepare for. But silence followed by absence, followed by the slow realization that someone was close enough to kill and you never knew, that gets inside a soldier's head in a way that conventional attack simply doesn't. The Germans began to understand that when they were facing Gurkha units, the danger did not come with warning. It came without warning, and often without sound, and sometimes seemingly without limit. After the war, a number of German military assessments referenced the Gurkha threat specifically, not as an abstract consideration, but as a documented tactical problem. How do you defend a position against soldiers who move without noise, who can navigate terrain in complete darkness, who fight at close range without hesitation, and who appear to treat conditions that would break other men as simply ordinary circumstances? The short answer, at the time, was that there was no clean defensive solution. You couldn't rely on your perimeter the same way. You couldn't trust that your sentries were still alive just because you hadn't heard anything. But it was the Second World War that produced the most documented and the most extreme accounts of Gurkha combat performance. And it was here that the phrase, "not human," starts appearing in the kind of records that historians have been studying ever since. When the war broke out in 1939, Gurkha regiments expanded rapidly. The British Indian Army, of which Gurkha battalions formed a significant part, needed fighters across multiple theaters simultaneously. North Africa, Italy, Burma, the Middle East. The Gurkhas went everywhere, and everywhere they went, they left the same impression. Let's start in North Africa, because it's here that some of the clearest early documentation of German reactions begins. The North African campaign was brutal in ways that are easy to underestimate looking back. The terrain was as hostile as the enemy. Extreme heat in the day, extreme cold at night. No natural cover across vast stretches of desert. Supply lines stretched to breaking, and enemy forces, particularly in the Rommel-led German Afrika Korps, that were skilled, experienced, and aggressive. The Gurkha battalions that served in North Africa operated under these conditions with what their officers consistently described as remarkable composure. But what the German forces noted was something more specific. It was the Gurkha approach to night combat that kept coming up in captured German communications and prisoner interrogations. In one documented series of engagements in Libya, a Gurkha unit was tasked with a night assault on a fortified German position. The orders were to take the position quietly, meaning without alerting neighboring strongpoints that might send reinforcements. The Gurkhas went in with kukris rather than rifles. The operation was completed. The position was taken, and neighboring German units had no idea anything had happened until they attempted to make contact the following morning. German prisoners, taken in subsequent engagements, described the effect this kind of operation had on morale. Not just the military result, which was significant in itself, but the psychological impact of knowing that your lines could be penetrated without warning, that men could die without firing a shot in response, that the darkness itself had become an active weapon in the hands of the enemy. But North Africa was only the beginning. Italy, 1943 and 1944. The Italian campaign is sometimes treated as a secondary theater compared to the Western Front. But for the men who fought through the mountains of central and southern Italy, through the mud and cold of that terrain, it was as brutal as anywhere else in the war. The Winter Line, the Gothic Line, Monte Cassino. These were fortified positions in mountain terrain where the Germans had every geographic advantage they could ask for, and they still encountered the Gurkhas. The mountain terrain of Italy suited Gurkha soldiers in the same way it suited the mountains of home. Not because the landscapes were identical, but because the underlying demands were the same. Altitude, cold, narrow paths, terrain that punished any soldier who didn't know how to read it and use it. Gurkha units were repeatedly assigned to operations in the most difficult sections of the Italian mountain campaign, not because they were being deliberately endangered, but because they were the units best qualified to operate there. At Monte Cassino, one of the most famous and prolonged engagements of the Italian campaign, Gurkha battalions played a significant role in repeated assault attempts on the German-held heights. The fighting there was ferocious in the most literal sense. Close range, often hand-to-hand, in terrain where artillery support was limited and tactical flexibility was everything. German defenders at Cassino had prepared deeply. They had fortified positions, overlapping fields of fire, and the natural advantage of height. They'd seen everything the Allied forces could throw at them: British units, American units, New Zealand units, Polish units. All had attempted and failed to dislodge the German position. The Gurkhas fought differently, not in terms of strategy alone, but in terms of the basic relationship to fear and to physical hardship that every soldier brings into combat. German accounts from Cassino specifically described the Gurkha assaults as something outside normal tactical experience, not because the Gurkhas were suicidal or reckless, but because they were calm, methodical, and completely undeterred by conditions that had broken other units. One German officer's account, referenced in multiple subsequent histories of the campaign, described watching Gurkha soldiers advance, under direct fire, without any visible change in their pace or posture, not running, not scrambling, moving forward steadily, through fire, that should have scattered or stopped any rational attacker. The conclusion drawn by the officer in question was that these men either did not feel fear in the conventional sense or had achieved some control over its physical expression that was simply not available to ordinary soldiers. Not human. That phrase, or its functional equivalent, appears in multiple German accounts across multiple theaters, and it's worth stopping to think about what it actually means when it's used in this context, because it's not a compliment delivered with admiration. It's an expression of genuine disorientation, of encountering something that didn't fit into any known category of combat experience. The German military in the Second World War was not composed of amateurs. The Wehrmacht had experienced officers who had campaigned in Poland, France, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. They had seen extraordinary things. They had faced determined resistance from multiple national armies. They were not easily startled by enemy capabilities, but the Gurkhas startled them anyway. The specific qualities that produced that reaction can be broken into components, though in practice, those components were inseparable from each other. The first was silence. The Gurkha ability to move without sound, particularly in darkness, was not mythological. It was trained, refined, and deliberate. It came from decades of operating in mountain terrain, where noise discipline was survival, not just tactics, where an animal or an enemy heard before it was seen had time to escape or respond. The same skill transferred directly to military operations, and in the context of trench raids, night assaults, and infiltration operations, it produced an enemy who arrived without announcement. The second was the relationship to close combat. Every military trains its soldiers for close quarters, fighting to some degree. But for most modern armies, close combat is an emergency. It's what happens when everything else has failed, when the distance has closed and there's no other option. For Gurkha soldiers, close combat was not an emergency. It was a practiced mode. The kukri was not a backup weapon. It was a primary tool for a specific range of engagement. And the level of training, comfort, and frankly proficiency that Gurkha soldiers brought to close quarters fighting was qualitatively different from what most combatants on either side of the war possessed. German soldiers trained for rifle warfare, for machine gun positions, for artillery coordination. They were not broadly trained for the kind of close, silent, blade-to-blade fighting that a Gurkha night raid delivered. The encounter created a mismatch that had nothing to do with courage or intelligence on either side. It was a mismatch of preparation and of fundamental assumptions about what combat looks like. The third component was endurance under physical hardship. This one is perhaps the least dramatic in isolation, but it shaped everything else. Gurkha soldiers maintained operational effectiveness in conditions that significantly degraded the performance of other units. Cold, mud, altitude, hunger, extended periods without resupply, extreme heat. These were not new experiences for men who had grown up in the Himalayas. The body's adaptation to altitude alone produces measurable physiological differences in cardiovascular efficiency and oxygen uptake. Men raised at altitude have larger lung capacity, different hemoglobin concentration, and a fundamentally different tolerance for physical exertion in low oxygen environments. Put those men at sea level, and they're running on excess capacity that flatland soldiers simply don't have. But beyond the physiology, there was the cultural dimension. Hardship was not abnormal in the experience of most Gurkha recruits. It was the baseline. The training environment they came from didn't prepare them to endure difficulty by simulating it. It prepared them simply because difficulty was what daily life looked like. The transition to military hardship was less dramatic for them because the gap between civilian experience and military experience was narrower. Put all three of those components together: silence in movement, mastery of close combat, and a fundamentally different relationship to physical hardship, and you begin to understand why the soldiers who faced them in combat struggled to describe the experience in conventional military terms. Now let's go to Burma, because Burma is where some of the most extraordinary individual accounts of Gurkha combat performance are recorded, and it's where the mythology and the documented reality converge most clearly. The Burma campaign was unlike any other theater of the Second World War. The terrain was jungle, dense, humid, and almost completely impenetrable by conventional standards. Supply was a constant nightmare. Disease killed as many men as bullets in many sectors. The Japanese forces opposing the Allies were ferocious, experienced jungle fighters who had already demonstrated across Southeast Asia that they were willing to fight to the last man, in ways that European and American military planners had not anticipated. Into this environment went the Gurkhas, and they were, by almost every account, exactly where they were supposed to be. The jungle is, in fundamental ways, another kind of mountain. Visibility is low. Movement is constrained to specific paths. Ambush is the dominant tactic for both offense and defense. Noise discipline matters enormously. The ability to navigate without landmarks in conditions of near-total darkness matters even more. All of these demands were things Gurkha soldiers had been dealing with, in one form or another, for their entire lives. But the Burma campaign also produced some of the most specific and documented individual acts of Gurkha combat that exist in the historical record, because it was here that multiple Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest military honor, were awarded to Gurkha soldiers for acts that were so extreme in their nature that the official citations read almost like fiction. Let's talk about Lakhiman Gurung. May 12, 1945. The Japanese were pressing a position held by a small section of Gurkha soldiers in the Irrawaddy Valley. Lakhiman Gurung was manning a forward trench when Japanese forces began lobbing grenades into his position. He threw the first one back. He threw the second one back. The third one exploded in his hand before he could throw it. The explosion destroyed his right hand. It tore through his arm and face. He was, by any standard measure, no longer a functional combatant. He should have been down. He should have been screaming. He should have been pulling back. He didn't. He picked up his rifle, held it one-handed against the trench wall, and continued firing, for 4 hours, alone, against repeated waves of Japanese assault. When his position was reached by reinforcements in the morning, there were 31 Japanese bodies around his trench. This is not a story that came from enemy accounts, describing the Gurkhas as supernatural. This is a documented, officially verified account, backed by eyewitnesses, and awarded the Victoria Cross by the British government. And it is not an isolated incident. The Victoria Cross citations for Gurkha soldiers fill volumes, and the pattern is consistent across them. Rifleman Ganju Lama, who kept firing an anti-tank gun after his wrist and leg were shattered, crawling forward to knock out Japanese tanks before accepting medical treatment. Agan Singh Rai, who charged alone into a machine gun position and destroyed it, then turned and charged a second position before the enemy had time to respond. Tol Bahadur Pun, who advanced alone across open ground under heavy fire to occupy a position that the rest of his section had been unable to reach, then single-handedly held it long enough for the unit to reorganize. Each of these accounts is, on its own, remarkable. Together, they form a pattern that goes beyond individual courage and suggests something systematic about how Gurkha soldiers related to combat at the extreme end of its spectrum. It wasn't that they didn't feel fear. That would be a dismissive and frankly incorrect interpretation. The psychological literature on extreme combat performance suggests that what distinguishes soldiers who continue to function under the most extreme stress is not the absence of fear, but a learned or trained capacity to continue making decisions and taking action despite it. The fear is present. The response is different. For Gurkha soldiers, that response had been shaped by centuries of cultural formation, years of rigorous training, and a set of values around honor and duty that were not abstract concepts, but were woven into daily life from childhood. The concept of izzat, meaning honor or reputation, was not a military doctrine imposed from above. It was a framework that preceded military service and gave it meaning. To fail in the face of the enemy was not simply a tactical setback. It was a profound personal and communal failure that most Gurkha soldiers were, by every account, unwilling to accept. That unwillingness produced the specific kind of combat performance that German officers described as not human, that Japanese forces described with similar language, that British commanders repeatedly noted with a combination of gratitude and something approaching awe. Now, let's talk about the weapon again, because the kukri deserves more attention than it typically gets in these discussions. The kukri's design is not accidental. It evolved over centuries of use in the terrain of Nepal, where a tool needed to function as a utility blade, a farming implement, a hunting weapon, and a combat knife. The inward curve of the blade was not an aesthetic choice. It was a functional one. When you chop downward with a kukri, the curve focuses force at the point of maximum impact, rather than distributing it along the blade the way a straight knife would. It cuts through material, both vegetable and otherwise, with less effort than a comparable straight blade. In combat, this translates to specific capabilities. At close range, the kukri doesn't require a long swing to generate damaging force. It requires precise positioning and a controlled motion. A skilled user with a kukri can deliver devastating cuts in spaces where a longer weapon becomes a liability, in trenches, in doorways, in the kind of dense jungle growth that makes a rifle almost useless as anything other than a bludgeon. The psychological dimension of the kukri should not be underestimated either. An enemy who knows that you are carrying a rifle is operating within a familiar threat model. They know what rifles do. They know what the sound of a rifle being brought to bear sounds like. They have training and instincts built around that specific threat. An enemy who knows that you carry a blade and that you are capable and willing to use it, in silence, at arm's length, in complete darkness, that enemy is operating outside their threat model, and that displacement, that confusion between expectation and reality, is itself a combat multiplier. It degrades decision-making. It creates hesitation. It turns routine defensive actions into exercises in uncertainty. German and Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with Gurkha units in close-quarters operations almost universally described heightened anxiety in sectors where Gurkha battalions were known to be active, not just in the moment of contact, but in the anticipation of it, the expectation that someone might be moving toward you in darkness, without sound, is profoundly disruptive to rest, to morale, and to the basic human need to feel that your environment is comprehensible. The Gurkhas understood this. It wasn't accidental, and it wasn't simply a byproduct of their tactics. It was, in many cases, deliberately cultivated. Psychological pressure was part of the operational logic. If the enemy is afraid of you, in ways that go beyond the rational assessment of firepower, that fear is a resource. You maintain it. You reinforce it. You let the reputation do some of the work before the blade ever needs to come out. And the reputation did do work. There are documented accounts from multiple theaters of enemy units choosing to withdraw or surrender upon confirmation that Gurkha forces were the unit they were facing, not because the Gurkhas were numerically superior, but because the psychological weight of what that identification meant had been established through years of combat contact. The name itself had become a tactical instrument. But let's be specific about what we mean when we talk about the night raids, because the general description, they moved silently and used their kukris, doesn't fully capture what these operations looked like in practice. A Gurkha night raid in the Second World War was not an improvised affair. It was planned in detail, executed with precision, and followed a logic that was as rigorous as any conventional military operation. The planning process began hours before deployment. The raiding party, typically small, often fewer than a dozen men, would study whatever intelligence was available about the target position. They would identify the most likely sentry positions, the most probable patrol routes, the terrain features that would allow approach without crossing open ground. Movement to the target position would begin well before the raid itself, in order to allow maximum time for slow, silent approach. Speed was actively undesirable. The slower the movement, the quieter the approach. Men who have been trained in this kind of movement learn to distribute their body weight with each step in a specific way that minimizes sound. They learn to test ground before committing to it. They learn to pause and listen at regular intervals and to distinguish between environmental sounds and the sounds of other human presence. Entry into the enemy position was typically achieved at the point of maximum vulnerability, meaning the gap between sentry positions or the approach angle that placed the maximum number of obstacles between the raiding party and any alarm that might be raised. The sentries themselves were the first priority, because a living, alarmed sentry could neutralize the entire operation, and the method used to deal with them was the kukri, because a blade in the right hands at the right distance generates no sound that travels beyond the immediate point of contact. Once inside the position, the raiding party would operate by pre-assigned task and by feel in darkness that made visual coordination essentially impossible. Each member knew their role before entry. Each member knew the withdrawal route and the timing signals. Communication during the operation itself was minimal, because every sound was a liability. The withdrawal was as carefully planned as the approach, because a raiding party that completes its objectives successfully but is caught in withdrawal has achieved nothing. The route back had to be planned to avoid the noise and movement of German or Japanese forces who might be reacting to the first signs that something had gone wrong at the target position. The whole operation, from movement to withdrawal, could take hours, and it required a level of sustained concentration, physical control, and psychological calm that most soldiers, however well trained, find extremely difficult to maintain over that duration in a hostile environment. Gurkha soldiers did this regularly, not as extraordinary performances, but as standard operational tasks assigned to units that had been assessed as capable of executing them reliably. And that reliability is what really distinguished the Gurkha performance. Not the peak moments, which were extraordinary by any standard, but the consistency. The fact that the same level of performance appeared in North Africa, and in Italy, and in Burma, and in other theaters simultaneously, under different commanders, against different opponents, in different terrain. The consistency suggested something that went deeper than training alone. It went to the formation of the soldiers themselves, to who they were before the British Army got hold of them. And that brings us back to Nepal. The recruitment of Gurkhas has always been extraordinary by conventional standards. The selection process, even in the 19th century, was not simply a matter of finding fit men who were willing to serve. Nepal has always produced more willing candidates than available positions by a significant margin. In some periods, tens of thousands of men have competed for a few hundred annual recruitment slots. The competition is not theoretical. It is rigorous, physically demanding, and fiercely desired. The men who arrive at recruitment selection centers in Nepal have typically been preparing for years, not for the selection itself in a formal sense, but in the way that growing up in a mountain culture prepares you for physical competition. They run hills, they carry loads, they navigate terrain that would shut down most training programs simply because it's what they do. The famous Doko race, in which candidates carry heavy baskets of rocks up steep hillside courses, is not a manufactured challenge designed to simulate hardship. It is an adaptation of work that Nepalese porters and farmers do as part of ordinary daily life. The young men who succeed in this competition arrive at British military training already possessing a baseline of physical capability and environmental resilience that takes most armies years to develop. What British training adds to that baseline is discipline, tactical doctrine, weapons proficiency, and institutional integration. The foundation is already there, but there's something else that comes with Gurkha recruits that formal training processes cannot create. It's the cultural framework around military service itself. In Nepal, joining a Gurkha regiment is not simply a career choice. It carries social and community significance that extends well beyond the individual soldier. Success in recruitment brings honor to the family, to the village, to the region. Failure is not catastrophic in personal terms, but success is celebrated in ways that give the service a meaning that transcends the practical. Young Gurkha soldiers know, before they ever put on a uniform, that they represent something larger than themselves. They carry a name, the Gurkha name, that carries its own weight. The expectation is not imposed from outside, it is internalized, and that internalization produces a specific kind of soldier, one who performs not only under observation, but in isolation, not only in favorable conditions, but in the worst conditions imaginable, not only when success seems possible, but when the situation has become desperate. This is the soldier that German officers encountered in North Africa and Italy. This is the soldier that Japanese forces faced in Burma. This is the soldier they struggled to describe in their own military language, because their military language had been built on assumptions about human performance that the Gurkhas did not respect. Not human. It was meant as an expression of confusion and fear, but in its own strange way, It was also the most accurate description they had available for something they genuinely could not categorize within their existing understanding of what soldiers were capable of. Let's move to the post-war period, because the story doesn't end in 1945. After the Second World War, the political arrangements around Gurkha service changed significantly. The partition of British India in 1947 and the subsequent emergence of independent India and Pakistan required a new framework for Gurkha recruitment and deployment. Under the Tripartite Agreement of 1947, some Gurkha regiments transferred to the new Indian Army, where they continue to serve today. Others remained with the British Army under a revised arrangement that has continued, in modified form, to the present. The British Gurkhas continued to fight Korea, Malaya, Borneo, Cyprus, the Falklands, Bosnia, Afghanistan. Every major deployment of the British Army since 1947 has included Gurkha units in one form or another, and in each of those theaters, the same pattern has appeared, the same combination of qualities, the same gap between what other units described as normal difficulty and what Gurkha soldiers appeared to experience as ordinary work. The Malayan emergency of the 1950s and early 1960s deserves particular attention because it was here that the Gurkha skill set found perhaps its most perfectly matched environment since Burma. The Malayan jungle was as dense and as demanding as anything the regiment had faced in the Second World War. The enemy, communist insurgents operating in small mobile cells, used exactly the kind of tactics that jungle terrain enabled: hit and run, ambush, disappear into the tree line. British conventional units found the Malayan jungle profoundly difficult to operate in. The terrain defeated navigation. The heat and humidity degraded equipment and personnel. The enemy's ability to move in the same jungle that constrained British movement made offensive operations extremely difficult. Gurkha battalions adapted faster, not because they had specific jungle training superior to that of other units, though they did, but because the basic demands of moving in dense terrain in low visibility were not foreign to them in the way they were to soldiers from Britain or other backgrounds. The jungle required the same fundamental skills that the mountains of Nepal required: attention to terrain, movement without noise, navigation by feel and by knowledge of pattern rather than by visible landmarks, self-sufficiency over extended periods without resupply. The Gurkha performance in Malaya was sufficiently distinctive that it became part of the operational doctrine for jungle warfare across the Commonwealth. Lessons drawn from Gurkha operations in that campaign were incorporated into training programs, into tactical manuals, into the conceptual framework that shaped how subsequent generations of British soldiers were prepared for jungle environments. Then came the Falklands, 1982. The Falklands War is in some ways the most dramatic modern demonstration of the Gurkha effect, because it happened in an era of live media coverage, in a conflict that the British public was intensely engaged with, and against an opponent that the Gurkha reputation itself may have influenced in a direct and measurable way. When Argentine forces learned that the 1st Battalion, 7th Duke of Edinburgh's own Gurkha Rifles, was among the British task force sailing south, the reaction among some Argentine units was one of documented concern, not routine military alertness. Concern. Reports from Argentine prisoners and subsequent historical analysis of Argentine command decisions suggest that the knowledge that Gurkhas were coming influenced force dispositions and, in some cases, individual decisions about whether to hold positions or withdraw. This is the reputation functioning as a weapon before a single shot is fired. The Gurkha name, carried across 2 world wars and a dozen subsequent conflicts, had reached a point where its deployment was itself a tactical communication. You are about to face something that German soldiers called not human. Adjust accordingly. The 1st 7th Gurkhas landed in the Falklands and were assigned operations in the final stages of the campaign, primarily around Port Stanley. By the time they were in direct contact with Argentine forces, many Argentine units were already in the process of collapse, demoralized by losses, by cold, by supply failures, and by the relentless pressure of British operations across the islands. The Gurkhas' advance contributed to that collapse. There are accounts from Argentine soldiers that the mere confirmation that Gurkha forces were in the vicinity produced immediate decisions to surrender or withdraw, not because of what the Gurkhas had done in that specific engagement, but because of what the name meant, because of what the accumulated record of 2 centuries of combat had deposited in the collective military consciousness of anyone who had studied modern warfare. The battle was over quickly on the Gurkha front, which is, in a strange way, testament to how completely the reputation had done its work before the fighting began. But let's not reduce the Gurkha story to myth and reputation alone, because there is real substance underneath it, and that substance is worth understanding clearly. The physical conditioning of a Gurkha soldier is not something that can be romanticized away. It is documented and measurable. Studies conducted by military medical researchers on Gurkha recruits have consistently found cardiovascular and musculoskeletal profiles that are exceptionally high, even within the context of elite military populations. The altitude physiology noted earlier is real and measurable. Lung function, oxygen uptake, recovery time after exertion. These are not things that training alone creates. They are the product of a lifetime of living and working at altitude, combined with aggressive physical preparation and a selection process that filters for the most capable candidates from an already self-selected population. The sensory skills developed by Gurkha soldiers, particularly the night movement and auditory awareness, have also been studied in training contexts. Instructors who have worked with Gurkha recruits consistently note a baseline of environmental awareness that exceeds what they observe in recruits from other backgrounds. The ability to identify and interpret environmental sounds, the instinct to use available cover without being explicitly directed to do so, the comfort with darkness and with limited visibility that allows sustained movement without the paralysis that affects many soldiers operating outside their comfort envelope. These are not mystical qualities. They are the products of a specific developmental environment, applied over years. But their effect in combat is, if anything, more impressive for being explicable, because it demonstrates that the performance is reproducible, consistent, and grounded in something real rather than luck or individual variation. The training pipeline that takes a Gurkha recruit from Nepal to operational deployment in the British Army is rigorous in ways that go beyond physical conditioning. The language requirement alone is significant. Gurkha soldiers must achieve functional English proficiency because the operational context requires it. For a young man from a rural Nepalese village, this represents a substantial cognitive and cultural transition that happens in parallel with physical and tactical training. The fact that Gurkha soldiers consistently pass this training, consistently meet operational standards, and consistently demonstrate the performance qualities under combat conditions that distinguish their history is not a coincidence. It is the output of a coherent system that begins in Nepal and culminates in deployment, and that system has been functioning in various forms for over 200 years. Today, the Brigade of Gurkhas is a component of the British Army that continues to recruit from Nepal. The numbers are smaller than at the peak of the regiment's deployment during the World Wars, but the standards are, if anything, higher. The competition remains intense, the selection process remains demanding, and the soldiers who complete it are deployed alongside the rest of the British Army in whatever operations the 21st century produces. Afghanistan was the most recent major test of the Gurkha performance in a sustained combat environment. Multiple Gurkha battalions rotated through the Helmand province, operating in terrain that was, in its fundamental demands, recognizable to soldiers from Nepal's mountain culture: altitude, harsh climate, complex terrain, an enemy that used ambush and infiltration as primary tactics. The accounts from Afghanistan are consistent with every preceding chapter of the Gurkha story. Operations conducted in conditions that degraded other units' performance. Close quarters engagements where the specific skill set of Gurkha soldiers proved decisive. Decorated performances under fire, and a persistent reputation among both Allied forces and the Taliban that the presence of Gurkha units in a particular sector changed the tactical calculus in ways that went beyond their raw numbers. There were accounts from local Afghan fighters